Alright, from around 250 to 66 million years ago, various dinosaurs roamed the Earth. Today, the only dinosaurs left are birds, which are Cellulosaurian theropods. Funnily enough, the same subgroup that Tyrannosaurus has belonged to. Think about that the next time you're enjoying a McDinosaur sandwich or scrambling up some dinosaur eggs for breakfast. Beyond their avian progeny, all that mostly remains of these once dominant creatures are fossilized bones, footprints, and poo. While many dinosaurs were actually quite small, some were comparatively massive, bringing us to the question of the hour, and that's what did people think when they first pulled huge dinosaur bones out of the earth? To begin with, it's generally thought that humans have been discovering dinosaur bones about as long as we've been humaning, and it appears that at least some of the giant creatures of ancient legend likely stemmed from the discovery of dinosaur bones and fossils and the subsequent attempts of ancient peoples to explain what they were. For example, 4th century BC Chinese historian Chang Ku reported the discovery of massive dragon bones in the region of Wuchen. At the time, and including for many centuries after, including some still today, the Chinese felt that these bones had potent healing powers, resulting in many of them being ground down and drunk in special elixirs. As for the exact medicinal purposes, in the 2nd century, Shenong Ben Chaojing states, dragon bone mainly treats heart and abdominal demonic influx, spiritual miasma, and old ghosts. It also treats cough and counterflow of qi, diarrhea, and dysentery with pus and blood, vaginal discharge, hardness and binding in the abdomen, and fright epilepsy in children. Dragon teeth mainly treats epilepsy, madness, manic running about, binding qi below the heart, inability to catch one's breath, and various kinds of spasms. It kills spiritual disruptors. Protracted taking may make the body light, enable one to communicate with the spirit light, and lengthen one's lifespan. While fossilized bones may not actually make such an effective cure-all, all things considered, the classic depictions of dragons and our modern understanding of what certain dinosaurs look like are actually rather in the ballpark of accurate. Moving over to the ancient Greeks, they are also believed to have stumbled across massive dinosaur bones and similarly assumed they came from long-dead giant creatures, in some cases seeming to think that they came from giant human-like creatures. So, moving on to better documented history, in the 16th through 19th centuries, the idea that the Earth was only about 6,000 years old was firmly entrenched in the Western world, leading to these fossils creating a major puzzle for the scientists studying them. Even Meriwether Lewis of the famed Lewis and Clark expedition found a dinosaur bone in Billings, Montana, but in his case, he decided it must have come from a massive fish, which is a common way they were explained away, given that no creatures that then walked the Earth seemed to match up. The various ideas thrown around during these centuries were described by Robert Plot in his 1677 Natural History of Oxfordshire. Are the stones we find in the forms of shellfish, be Lepidopsis generis, fossils naturally produced by some extraordinary plastic virtue latent in the earth or quarries where they are found, or do they rather owe their form and figuration to the shells of the fishes they represent, brought to the places they are now found by a deluge, earthquake, or some other such means, and there being filled with mud, clay, and petrifying juices, have in tract of time been turned into stones as we now find them, still retaining the same shape and the whole, with the same lineations, sutures, eminescences, cavities, orifices, points that they had whilst they were shells. Plot goes on to explain the idea behind the plastic virtue hypothesis was that the fossils were some form of salt crystals that had, by some unknown process, formed and grown in the ground and just so happened to resemble bones. However, Plot argues against this then popular notion, stating, "Come we next to such stones as concern the members of the body, amongst which I have one that has exactly the figure of the lowermost part of the thigh bone of a man, or at least of some other animal, a little above the sinus, where it seems to have been broken off, shewing the marrow within of a shining spar-like substance of its true colour and figure in the hollow of the bone." After comparing the bone to an elephant's, he decided it could not have come from one of them. He instead concluded, "It remains that, notwithstanding their extravagant magnitude, they must have been the bones of men or women. Nor doth any thigh hinder, but they may have been so, provided it be clearly made out that there have been men and women of proportionable stature in all ages of the world, down even to our own days." Thus, much like is thought to have happened with certain ancient peoples, he decided some of these bones must have come from giant humans of the past. During Plot's era, the Bible's mention of such giants was often put forth as evidence, such as in Numbers, where it states, "The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Though the bone Plot was describing has since been lost to history, he left detailed drawings from which it's thought to have come from the lower part of the femur of a megalosaurus, literally a giant lizard. But before it was called the megalosaurus, it had a rather more humorous name. You see, in 1763, a physician called Richard Brooks, studying Plot's drawings, dubbed it Scrotum humanum because he thought it looked like a set of petrified testicles. To be clear, Brooks knew it wasn't a fossil of a giant scrotum, but nevertheless decided to name it thus because apparently men of all eras of human history can't help but make genital jokes at every opportunity. While hilarious in the 20th century, this posed a problem for the International Commission for Zoological Nomenclature when it eventually came time to formally classify the megalosaurus as such. The problem was, of course, that Brooks had named it first. Eventually, the ICZN decided that since nobody after Brooks had called it Scrotum humanum, even though he was the first to name it, that name could safely be deemed invalid. Thus, Megalosaurus won out, which is unfortunate because discussion of the rather large Scrotum humanum would have provided great companion jokes to ones about Uranus in science classes the world over. Moving swiftly on, humanity continued to have little clear idea of what dinosaur bones were until William Buckland's work on the aforementioned Megalosaurus in 1824. As for the word dinosaur itself, this wouldn't be coined until 1842 when British scientist Sir Richard Owen noted that the few dinosaur fossils that had been scientifically studied at that point all shared several characteristics. For the curious, those species were the Megalosaurus, the Hylaeosaurus, and the Iguanodon. He further concluded that the fossils could not have come from any creatures that currently roamed the earth, and thus came up with a new name, dinosaur, meaning terrible, powerful, wondrous lizards. Of course, it should be noted that despite being knighted for his life's work in 1883, Owen was renowned for stealing other people's ideas and calling them his own, in at least one case, even after having previously ridiculed the person he stole the ideas from, and that was paleontologist Gideon Mantell. In several instances, Owen would attempt to take credit for some of Mantell's pioneering work on the Iguanodon while downplaying Mantell's contributions in the process. To add insult to injury, it is speculated that the much more distinguished Owen actively worked to stop some of Mantell's work and papers from getting published. To further illustrate Owen's character and rivalry with Mantell, after near financial ruin in 1838, his wife leaving him in 1839 and his daughter dying in 1840, Mantell would become crippled after a fall from a carriage on October 11, 1841. Previous to the accident, he had frequently suffered from leg and back pain, but the source of it was dismissed as likely due to the long hours of work that he put in and things like that. Things got worse when a coach he was on crashed, shortly before which Mantell leapt from it. In the aftermath, his former pain became extreme and he ceased to be able to use his legs properly. As he writes, "I cannot stoop or use any exertion without producing loss of sensation and power in the lower limbs. And could I choose my destiny, I would gladly leave this weary pilgrimage." He later laments in his journal, "My long probation of suffering will be terminated by a painful and lingering death." Okay, so what does any of that have to do with Owen? To add insult to injury, after Mantell died from an opium overdose taken to help relieve some of his constant and extreme pain, several obituaries were published of Mantell. They were all glowing except for one. This one was anonymously written, though analyses of the writing style and general tone left few among the local scientific community with any doubt about who had written it. In it, Owen starts off praising Mantell, stating, "On Wednesday evening last, at the age of about 63 or 64, died the renowned geologist Gideon Algernon Mantell." It goes on to note how Mantell's memoir on the Iguanodon saw him the recipient of the prestigious Royal Medal. Of course, later in the article, Owen claims Mantell's work, for which he won the medal, was actually stolen from others, including himself. He states, "The history of the fossil reptile, for the discovery of which Dr. Mantell's name will be longest recollected in science, is a remarkable instance of this. Few who have become acquainted with the Iguanodon by the perusal of the Medals of Creation would suspect that to Cuvier we owe the first recognition of its reptilian character, to Clift the first perception of the resemblance of its teeth to those of the iguano, to Conybeare its name, and to Owen its true affinities among reptiles, and the correction of the error respecting its build and alleged horn." The article then goes on to outline Dr. Mantel's supposed various failings as a scientist, such as his reluctance to the revelation of a truth when it dispossessed him of a petty illustration, as well as accusing him, once again, of stealing other people's work, stating, "To touch lightly on other weaknesses of this enthusiastic diffuser of geological knowledge, we must also notice that a consciousness of the intrinsic want of exact scientific and especially anatomical knowledge, which compelled him privately to have recourse to those possessing it, produced extreme susceptibility of any doubt expressed of the accuracy or originality of that which he advanced, and in his popular summaries of geological facts he was too apt to forget the sources of information which he had acknowledged in his original memoirs." It finally concludes, as it started, on a compliment. Dr. Mantel has, however, done much after his kind for the advancement of geology, and certainly more than any man living to bring it into attractive popular notice. It's commonly stated from here that, out of spite, Owen also had a piece of Mantel's deformed spine pickled and put on a shelf in the Hunterian Museum in London, where Owen was the curator. However, while this was done, the examination and study of the spine was done at the behest of Mantel himself. Thus, an autopsy was performed, and an examination of Mantel's spine showed that he had a rather severe and, at least at the time, peculiar case of scoliosis. As to what was so interesting about this case, one of the physicians involved, Dr. William Adams, states it was discovered that the severest degree of deformity of the spine may exist internally, without the usual indications in respect of the deviation of the spinous processes externally. In other words, in other such cases, it was clear that the spine was not straight from visual observation of the person's back, where a curve could be observed. Mantel's spine, however, exhibited severe scoliosis, but in such a way that upon external examination, it otherwise appeared straight. To Adams's knowledge, such a thing had never been observed before, but if Mantel had this particular brand of scoliosis, surely many others did as well. But the question now was how to detect it. Mulling over the problem inspired Dr. Adams to come up with a method to make such a deformity visible with external examination, thus giving the world the Adams forward bend test, which many a school student even today has no doubt recollections of being subjected to periodically. Going back to Owen, as to why he seems to have hated Mantel so much, this isn't fully clear, though it may simply have been Mantel's work sometimes resulted in showing Owens to be incorrect in various assumptions, as well as jealousy of a scientist that he deemed inferior to himself, or maybe it was just that Owens was a bit of a dick. As noted by famed biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, it is astonishing with what an intense feeling of hatred Owen is regarded by the majority of his contemporaries, with Mantel as arch-hater. The truth is, Owen is the superior of most and does not conceal that he knows it, and it must be confessed that he does some very ill-natured tricks now and then. Of course, if you steal other people's work long enough, eventually you're going to get caught, especially when you're one of the world's leading scientists in your field. Owen's misstep occurred when he was awarded the prestigious Royal Medal from the Royal Society for his supposedly pioneering discovery and analysis of belemnites, which he called the Belemnites Oweni after himself, and gave no credit to anyone else for the ideas in the paper. It turns out, however, 4 years previously it attended a Geological Society get-together in which an amateur scientist by the name of Channing Pierce gave a lecture and published a paper on that very same creature. While Owen was allowed to keep his medal even after it was revealed he'd stolen the work of Pierce, the rumors that he'd similarly borrowed other ideas without credit and this subsequent proof resulted in the loss of much of his former academic prestige. Things didn't improve over the following years, and Owen was eventually given the boot from the Royal Society in 1862, despite his long and rather distinguished career. While he would never again do any scientific work of significance, his post-plagiarist career did really prove to be a huge boon for those who enjoyed museums. You see, up until this point, museums were not really places that were open to the public, and to get access, you usually needed to be an academic. These were places for research, not for random plebeians to just gawk at things. After losing any shred of respect from his peers, he eventually devoted his energies into his role as superintendent of the Natural History Department of the British Museum. Among other things, as superintendent, he pushed for and helped develop London's now famed Natural History Museum in London. He also instituted a number of changes, such as encouraging the general public to come and visit the museum at their leisure, and devoted the majority of the displays for public use, and had labels and descriptions added below each display explaining what each was of, so anybody, not just the educated, could understand what they were looking at, etc. Many among the scientific community fought against these changes, but he did them anyway, giving us the modern idea of a museum in the process. In any event, after Owens, Mantel's, and their contemporaries' work finally revealed these long-extinct creatures for what they were, interest in dinosaurs exploded, exploded, resulting in what has come to be known as the Bone Wars between rival paleontologists in the 1890s, which got so heated that some paleontologists literally resorted to dynamiting mines to beat their rivals to discoveries. The most famous such rivals were Othniel Marsh of the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale and Edward Cope of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. While the pair started out friendly, even choosing to name species after one another, they eventually became bitter enemies, and when they weren't doing everything in their power to find dinosaur bones as fast as possible, they were writing and giving talks insulting each other's work. They also made efforts to get each other's funding cancelled, they stole discoveries from one another, and whenever possible, they tried to destroy the other's work. In the end, the product of this rivalry was the discovery of a whopping 142 different dinosaur species, and for the record, Marsh discovered 86, Cope 56. Before ending any discussion of this Wild West of dinosaur bone hunting and scholarship, would be remiss without noting the unsung hero of it all, Mary Anning, who is credited with finding many of the fossils used by other scientists for their discoveries, like the long-extinct ichthyosaur, plesiosaurus, in fact finding the first complete plesiosaurus, and the flying pterosaur. Anning was also noted to be popularly consulted by scientists the world over for her expertise in identifying types of dinosaurs from their bones and various insights she had on them, with many world-renowned scientists actually choosing to make the journey to her little shop in person where she sold these bones in Dorset, England. Almost completely uneducated formerly, and having grown up relatively poor, with her father dying when she was 11, Anning's expertise came from literally a lifetime of practice, as her family lived near the cliffs near Lyme Regis, and from a little girl she helped dig out bones and sell them in her shop. Without access to formal scientific education, she eventually took to dissecting many modern animals to learn more about anatomy. She also was an insatiable reader of every scientific paper she could get her hands on related to geology, paleontology, and animals. In many cases, unable to afford to buy copies of the papers, she'd simply borrow them from others and then meticulously copy them herself, with reportedly astounding exact replications of technical illustrations. On that note, Lady Harriet Sylvester would describe Anning in 1824. The extraordinary thing in this young woman is that she has made herself so thoroughly acquainted with the science that the moment she finds any bones, she knows to what tribe they belong. She fixes the bones on a frame with cement and then makes drawings and has them engraved. It is certainly a wonderful instance of divine favor that this poor ignorant girl should be so blessed, for by reading and application she has arrived to that degree of knowledge as to be in the habit of writing and talking with professors and other clever men on the subject, and they all acknowledge that she understands more of the science than anyone else in this kingdom. Despite finding some of the best-known specimens of these creatures and risking her life on a daily basis during a hunt for fossils around the dangerous cliffs, Anning got little public credit for her discoveries owing to a number of factors, including that she was a woman from a dissenting religious sect against the Church of England and otherwise, as noted, had no real formal education. So it was quite easy for scientists to take any of her ideas that she had about the bones and claim them as their own discovery. As Anning herself would lament, "The world has used me so unkindly, I fear it has made me suspicious of everyone." A companion of hers, Anna Rini, would go on to state, "These men of learning have sucked her brains and made a great deal of publishing works, of which she furnished the contents, while she derives none of the advantages." That said, given the esteem she was regarded in by many scientists, some of them did desire her to be given credit for her contributions. One such person like this was famed Swiss paleontologist Louis Agassiz, who was one of the many to visit Anning's shop to pick her brain about various things. Ultimately, he credited her in his book Studies of Fossil Fish. Further praising her work a few years later was an article in the Bristol Mirror stating, "This persevering female has for years gone daily in search of fossil remains of importance at every tide for many miles under the hanging cliffs at Lyme, whose fallen masses are her immediate object, as they alone contain these valuable relics of a former world, which must be snatched at the moment of their fall, at the continual risk of being crushed by the half-suspended fragments they leave behind, or be left to be destroyed by the returning tide. To her exertions, we owe nearly all the fine specimens of ichthyosauri of the great collections." Of the dangers of her work, Anning once wrote to a friend, Charlotte Murchison, in 1833, "Perhaps you will laugh when I say that the death of my old faithful dog has quite upset me. The cliff that fell upon him and killed him in a moment before my eyes and close to my feet, it was but a moment between me and the same fate." Beyond academic credit, in one lean stretch where Anning's family was unable to find any new fossils and they had to start selling off all their worldly possessions just to eat and keep a roof over their heads, one of their best customers, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas James Birch, decided to auction off many of the bones he had bought from them, and instead of keeping the money, he gave it to Anning's family. Of this, in a letter to Gideon Mansell, Birch stated the auction was For the benefit of the poor women who, in truth, found almost all the fine things which have been submitted to scientific investigation. I may never again possess what I am about to part with, yet in doing it, I shall have the satisfaction of knowing that the money will be well applied. Beyond the approximately £400 that this brought in, about £48,000 today, this also significantly raised awareness among the scientific community of the family's contributions to this particular branch of science. Further, when she lost her life savings apparently after being swindled by a conman in 1835, the aforementioned William Buckland managed to convince the British government and the British Association for the Advancement of Science to give her a pension of £25 per year, about £3,000 today, in recognition of her work's importance to science. On top of this, when she was dying of breast cancer in the 1840s and couldn't continue on in her work as before, the Geological Society provided additional financial support to make sure she was taken care of. After her death, they also commemorated a stained glass window in 1850 in her memory with the inscription, "This window is sacred to the memory of Mary Anning of this parish, who died 9th of March, AD 1847, and is erected by the Vicar and some members of the Geological Society of London in commemoration of her usefulness in furthering the science of geology, as also of her benevolence of heart and integrity of life." The president of the Geological Society, Henry de la Beche, would also write a eulogy for her, which stated in part, "I cannot close this notice of our losses by death without adverting to that of one who, though not placed among even the easier classes of society, but one who had to earn her daily bread by her labor, yet contributed by her talents and untiring researches in no small degree to our knowledge." This was the first eulogy for a woman the Society had ever published, and the first time such a eulogy had been given for a non-fellow.
In a memorable scene in the 1993 comedy Mrs. Doubtfire, unemployed voice actor Daniel Hillard, played by Robin Williams, comes across a set of plastic toy dinosaurs and uses them to compose a catchy rap. "I'm a raptor, doing what I can, gonna eat everything till the appearance of man. Yo, yo, see me. I'm living beneath the soil. I'll be back, but I'm coming as oil." As well as showcasing the incomparable Williams at the height of his improvisational powers, this scene illustrates a common myth that has persisted for decades, that crude oil derives from the bodies of dinosaurs. People believe this? But as romantic and logical as this notion might seem, after all, why else would we call them fossil fuels? It simply isn't true. Everyone's favorite prehistoric reptiles have nothing to do with the black gold that powers and is slowly killing the modern world. But how did this myth come to be in the first place? Surprisingly, unlike many modern myths, this one can almost be entirely traced back to a single source. It's an origin story that involves a corporate giant, two of the greatest cultural events of the 20th century, and a case of clever, if misleading, marketing. When petroleum, the word derived from the Greek words for stone and oil, is derived from ancient organisms, the organisms in question are far smaller and less glamorous than dinosaurs, microscopic ocean-dwelling plants and animals known as algae and zooplankton. When these organisms die, they rain down onto the ocean floor, gradually piling up in thick layers. These deposits of organic matter are then covered over with layers of silt, pushing them ever deeper beneath the surface. Over millions of years, the silt layers build up to a kilometer or more in thickness, slowly solidifying into sedimentary rock such as shale. The immense pressure of this rock pressing down upon the remains of the plankton and algae creates the ideal conditions for converting these remains into petroleum. The first step in this process occurs until the remains are 10 meters below the surface and involves the decomposition of the plankton and algae by anaerobic bacteria, which do not require oxygen to survive. These bacteria break down sulfates and nitrates in the organism's bodies into hydrogen sulfide and nitrogen and polysaccharides, and proteins into simple sugars and amino acids, and eventually strip the remains of most of their nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, leaving behind mostly carbon and hydrogen. Past 10 meters in depth, the heat and pressure exerted by the overlying rock layers kill the bacteria and halts decomposition. Now begins the next stage of petroleum formation, the recombination of the simple hydrocarbons produced by the bacteria into a solid wax-like substance known as kerogen. This process continues until a depth of around 1 kilometer, below which the third step can begin, the conversion of kerogen into petroleum. This process is highly sensitive to temperature and can only occur within a narrow range known as the oil window. Below the window, the hydrocarbons remain trapped as kerogens, while above the window, the heat and pressure decompose the kerogens into lighter hydrocarbons like methane, creating natural gas. To be easily accessible and extractable, petroleum and natural gas must be expelled from the source rock where where it was formed and accumulate in a reservoir. A typical reservoir or trap consists of a layer of permeable stone covered in a layer of impermeable caprock like sandstone or salt, which traps the oil and gas and prevents it from reaching the surface. To extract the petroleum, oil workers drill down through the caprock into the reservoir. In most cases, the pressure of the natural gas, which accumulates at the top of the reservoir, causes the oil to flow back up the borehole on its own. After this pressure dissipates, however, the remainder of the oil must be actively pumped out. While this is the traditional method for extracting oil, in recent years, advances in technology and the depletion of traditional oil reserves has led to the increased exploitation of more unconventional reservoirs. These include oil shale, immature source rock that has not yet expelled its petroleum into a reservoir, and oil sands, deposits of sands or sandstone into which petroleum has seeped and solidified to form a hard, sticky substance called bitumen or pitch. And for more on the strange properties of this substance, please do check out our previous video, Waiting for the Drop. For the vast majority of Earth's petroleum deposits, the conversion process from plankton and algae to oil and gas began between 250 to 360 million years ago during the Carboniferous and Permian periods, long before the Mesozoic era when dinosaurs roamed the Earth. Furthermore, the biomass of all the dinosaurs that ever lived during their 188 million year reign is dwarfed by the sheer mass of plankton and algae biomass in the oceans, meaning that if oil was made from dinosaurs, there would be significantly less of it around for us to extract. So, if oil is not made from dinosaurs, why then do we call it fossil fuel? Well, contrary to popular belief, the term fossil does not mean petrified organism. Rather, it is derived from the Latin fossilis, meaning obtained by digging. The term fossil fuel was coined in 1759 by German chemist Caspar Neumann to differentiate oil and coal, itself formed from the remains of ancient plants, converted by heat and pressure into carbon from surface-based fuels such as wood. Given these common misconceptions, it is tempting to think that the oil is made of dinosaurs myth was simply the product of associating fossil fuels with fossils and fossils with dinosaurs. In reality, however, the origin of this myth is far more specific and involves one of history's greatest producers of petroleum, the Sinclair Oil Corporation. Founded in 1916 by Harry F. Sinclair, Sinclair Oil quickly grew into the 7th largest oil company in the US and the largest in the American Midwest. The company's first association with dinosaurs came in 1930 when it launched a series of oil cans featuring illustrations of 12 different dinosaurs. The cans were part of an advertising campaign to promote Pennsylvania and Opaline brand lubricants derived from crude oil, then thought to have been formed during the Mesozoic era. The campaign was a hit, with the Brontosaurus proving so popular that Sinclair registered it as a company trademark in 1932. Dubbed Dino, the green Brontosaurus logo soon became a familiar sight along American highways, adorning hundreds of Sinclair service stations across the country. The following year, Sinclair sponsored a dinosaur-themed exhibit at the 1933 to 1934 Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago, which featured 9 life-sized model dinosaurs in recreated prehistoric settings. An accompanying exhibit educated visitors about the prehistoric origins of petroleum and how the company extracted, refined, and distributed petroleum products around the world. Sinclair's aim in linking dinosaurs with oil was to convince its customers that better oil came from older deposits, with its advertising literature touting that its products were mellowed 80 million years. Unfortunately, the public took the association a little too literally, and the myth that oil came from dinosaurs was thusly born. Sinclair's 1933 exhibit was a smash hit and one of the most popular attractions at the fair, prompting the company to go all in on dinosaur-themed branding. A line of colourful rubber Brontosaurus toys soon appeared for sale at Sinclair service stations, while an anthropomorphic dino dressed as a service attendant promoted Sinclair products in print advertisements. Some Sinclair stations even built life-size models of the company mascot straddling the entrance, creating readily visible highway landmarks. Around the same time, Sinclair entered a partnership with American paleontologist Barnum Brown, curator of fossil reptiles at the American Museum of Natural History and the discoverer of the first Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton in 1902. In exchange for funding his expeditions, Brown wrote promotional materials for Sinclair and designed a series of dinosaur-themed stamps, which proved so popular that the first printing sold out in a single day. Sinclair restaged its 1933 exhibit at the Texas Centennial Exposition in 1936 and the New York World's Fair in 1939, wowing visitors and further cementing the link between dinosaurs and oil in the popular imagination. 24 years later, the company achieved yet another publicity milestone when its famous logo made its debut as a giant balloon in the 1963 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. The balloon proved so popular that in 1975, Dino was named an honorary member of the Museum of Natural History. But Dino's greatest triumph would come the following year, when Sinclair staged an enhanced version of its 1933 exhibit called Dinoland at the 1964 to 1965 New York World's Fair, which featured 9 dinosaur models designed by famed sculptor and diorama maker Louis Paul Jonas. Improved technology allowed all 9 of the models, including the Brontosaurus, to be fitted with animatronics and placed in lifelike environments complete with a bubbling volcano and flashing lighting, creating an experience Sinclair touted as lifelike and authentic as modern science and painstaking research can make it. Having learned the power of merchandising from its previous exhibits, Sinclair made sure that Dinoland kept plenty of keepsakes on hand for visitors to take home, including a book titled Sinclair and the Exciting World of Dinosaurs. But perhaps the most popular attraction at Dinoland, and the fair as a whole, was the Mold-O-Rama machine, which for a mere 25 cents injection molded one of 7 plastic dinosaur figures right in front of the user's eyes. Doubtless the proliferation of tiny dinosaurs made of plastic, a material from oil, helped to further cement the link between the two in the minds of impressionable fair-going children. The connection was likely not lost on their parents either, for Sinclair service stations were prominently featured in both of the fair's parking lots. Despite incidents like 2 dinosaurs being mysteriously stolen in 1965, Dinoland once again proved a smash hit, being seen by nearly 50 million visitors over the fair's 2 seasons. Indeed, the exhibit attracted attention even before the fair's opening, as the exhibit's 9 dinosaurs traveled 200 kilometers by barge down the Hudson River to the fairgrounds in Queens. After the fair closed, Sinclair rode the wave of publicity by sending the exhibit's dinosaurs on a tour of American shopping centers, after which the models were sold off to various museums and parks. Today, all but one of the original 9 dinosaurs are still on display, with the 2 most popular, Tyrannosaurus and Brontosaurus, residing at Dinosaur Valley State Park near Glen Rose, Texas. Much has been learned about the prehistoric world since the time of the New York World's Fair. For example, we now know that the species of Sinclair's mascot, Brontosaurus, did not actually exist and was mistakenly created by paleontologist Othniel Marsh in 1896 by combining the body of an Apatosaurus with the head of a Camarasaurus. We have also learned that the vast majority of petroleum deposits predate the age of the dinosaurs, disproving even the tentative link that Sinclair was trying to make in its exhibits and advertisements. But the damage is already done, and thanks to a clever marketing campaign nearly a century ago, the myth that oil is made of dinosaurs will likely persist for decades to come.
If you've ever ridden in an ambulance, visited a hospital, or picked up a prescription at a pharmacy, you've likely come across an unusual symbol: a vertical rod of a staff with a snake coiled around it. Known as the rod or staff of Asclepius, this emblem is recognized the world over as the universal symbol of medicine. But where did this ubiquitous symbol come from, and how did it come to stand for the entire healing profession? The answer is a lot more complicated and more fascinating than you might think. Asclepius was the ancient Greek and Roman god of medicine and healing, born of an affair between Apollo, god of light, and Coronis, a mortal woman from Thessaly. According to legend, when Apollo returned to Delphi, Coronis ran off with a mortal man named Ischys. Apollo was informed of her infidelity by a white raven, and in his anger, all the ravens turned black forever. He then proceeded to send Artemis, goddess of the hunt, to shoot Coronis with an arrow. As Coronis lay dying on her funeral pyre, she admitted that she deserved her fate, but felt that letting her unborn child die was cruel and unfair. Apollo agreed and performed the world's first caesarean section, delivering his son Asclepius just before Coronis was consumed by flame. Having no time to raise the boy himself, Apollo placed Asclepius in the care of the wise centaur Chiron, the tutor of many other Greek heroes, including Theseus, Perseus, and Achilles. Under Chiron's tutelage, Asclepius became a great healer and traveled throughout the ancient world applying his medical skills. On one occasion, he was called upon to heal the son of Minos, ruler of the island of Crete. When Asclepius admitted that there was nothing he could do, King Minos had him and his son locked in a room together. During their captivity, a snake slithered under the door, which Asclepius immediately killed. A second snake then entered and placed a leaf on the first, restoring it to life. Asclepius then used this leaf to heal Minos' son. Snakes thereafter became associated with Asclepius and the practice of medicine. Asclepius' healing powers soon became legendary. When Phaedra, daughter of Minos, was spurned by Hippolytus, son of the hero Theseus, she called upon Poseidon, god of the sea, to kill him. While Hippolytus was driving his chariot along the coast, Poseidon raised a sea monster from the ocean, spooking the horses and causing Hippolytus to crash, killing him instantly. Asclepius was summoned and managed to raise Hippolytus from the dead. This ability angered Hades, god of the underworld, who induced Zeus, king of the gods, to strike down Asclepius with a thunderbolt. Apollo was so enraged at the death of his son that he began firing arrows at the Cyclopses of Mount Etna, the makers of Zeus's thunderbolts. In retaliation, Zeus sentenced Apollo to live 1 year on Earth as a mortal. However, at the request of his father, Asclepius was accepted into the Olympian pantheon as the god of healing, and his image placed among the stars as the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. Interestingly, Asclepius may actually have been a real person who lived around 1200 BCE. He is mentioned in Homer's Iliad as a great physician whose sons, Machaon and Podalirius, served as surgeons for the Greek forces during the Trojan War. Asclepius also had 4 daughters: Hygelia, the goddess of cleanliness; Iaso, goddess of recuperation; Acesso, goddess of the healing process; Algaea, goddess of splendor and adornment; and Panacea, the goddess of the universal cure. But whether or not he actually existed, Asclepius was widely worshipped as the god of healing, with his main temple and oracle located at Epidaurus. Pilgrims seeking cures for various ailments traveled from across Greece to sleep on the temple floor. Any dreams or visions they received during the night were interpreted by the temple priests and used to prescribe the appropriate remedy. Certain Asclepian temples even kept sacred dogs to lick and heal the wounds of sick pilgrims, while sacred snakes were allowed to roam the temple grounds at will. These non-venomous Asclepian snakes are still found in the area to this day. From Epidaurus, the Asclepian cult and its practitioners rapidly spread across the ancient world. Perhaps the most famous Asclepian physician of all was Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, whose original Hippocratic oath invoked not only Asclepius, but also his daughters Hygeia and Panacea. The Asclepian cult reached its peak in the 3rd century AD, when over 500 temples could be found as far afield as Scotland, Egypt, Spain, and Persia. According to legends, the cult spread to Rome during a great plague when a ship was sent to Epidaurus in search of a cure. Asclepius, in the form of a snake, boarded the ship and returned to Rome. On arrival, the snake slithered into the Tiber River and swam to a nearby island where a temple to Asclepius was duly erected. The origins and symbolic meaning of the Asclepian snake and staff is widely debated by historians and folklorists. The most common interpretation holds that the snake, which sheds its skin in order to grow, was seen by the ancients as a symbol of renewal and healing. Another theory involves the dual nature of snake venom, which is harmful or even fatal when injected, but often safe if ingested. Venom and other products derived from snakes were widely used in ancient Greek medicine, and this ambiguity became symbolic of pharmacology as a whole. Indeed, the word pharmakon meant both medicine and poison in ancient Greek. In either case, the staff around which the snake is wound is commonly thought to represent the walking stick carried by traveling physicians like Asclepius. When or how the two symbols became combined, however, is unknown. A more intriguing theory posits that the animal wrapped around the staff of Asclepius is not a snake at all, but rather a parasite, specifically Dracunculus medanesis, or the guinea worm. Endemic to large areas of sub-Saharan Africa, the guinea worm lives in freshwater lakes and rivers, where it typically infects fish and tiny crustaceans called copepods. The female guinea worm releases her eggs into the water, which hatch into larvae, which are then ingested by copepods. When a human drinks untreated water containing infected copepods, the larvae are released into the new host's digestive tract. These larvae then burrow through the intestinal walls into the abdominal cavity, where they grow, mature, and mate. After mating, the male worms die, while the female worms migrate towards the skin's surface, typically in the legs. Then, around a year after initial infection, the worm forms a large blister on the host's skin, which ruptures and allows the worm to escape. That is horrible. This process can take days or even weeks and is extremely painful, leading the host to immerse the open wound in water to relieve the pain. This in turn allows the worm to release her eggs, starting the whole process anew. Guinea worm disease once affected around 3.5 million people worldwide every year. However, it's well on its way to becoming the second infectious disease after smallpox to be completely eradicated. Good. Since 1980, a CDC and WHO eradication program has, through the distribution of water filters and other initiatives, succeeded in reducing the number of countries with guinea worm from 20 to just 7. In 2018, there were only 28 reported cases worldwide. The traditional treatment for guinea worm disease is to wrap one end of the emerging worm around a stick or roll of gauze and slowly spool it out of the wound over the course of several days. This technique is ancient, appearing in the Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical treatise treatise dating from around 1550 BC. The practice would have been well known to the ancient Greeks and may possibly have inspired the image of a serpent coiled around a staff. Yet another theory traces the symbol to the Bible, wherein Moses is said to have carried a bronze staff with the figure of a serpent wrapped around it. Anyone bitten by a snake had only to look upon the staff to be healed of its venom. A related symbol widely used by pharmacists is the bowl of Hygeia, consisting of a cup with a snake coiled around it. After the death of Asclepius, his daughter Hygeia, the goddess of cleanliness, was assigned to keep his temples clean. The bowl she carried for this purpose was combined with the figure of the sacred snakes occupying the temple to form the modern-day symbol. The bowl of Hygeia is most commonly used by European pharmacies, where it is often combined with the figure of scales and a green Greek cross. In the United States, the mortar and pestle, the traditional symbol of the apothecary or pharmacist, is more common. The staff of Asclepius is often confused with a similar ancient symbol known as a caduceus, which features not one, but two snakes coiled around a staff and is often topped with wings. But the caduceus is the symbol not of Asclepius, but rather the messenger god Hermes, known to the Romans as Mercury. According to legend, Hermes once saw a pair of snakes fighting and threw his staff to stop them. To his surprise, the snakes coiled around the staff and froze in place. Hermes duly adopted the staff as his personal symbol, adding the wings to symbolize his legendary speed and efficiency. Over the centuries, the caduceus came to be associated with trade, honesty, and craftsmanship, and became the symbol of merchants, craftsmen, and, oddly enough, thieves. While the similarity between the caduceus and the staff of Asclepius and its association with honesty and craft, positive attributes for a physician, perhaps made such confusion inevitable, exactly when and where this first occurred is unclear. One theory blames John Caius, president of the Royal College of Physicians, who in 1556 created a silver caduceus scepter to be presented to all future college presidents as a badge of office, while another theory cites the widespread 16th and 17th century use of the caduceus as a printer's mark, especially in the frontispieces of medical treatises and pharmacopoeias. However, even as late as 1854, it appears that the distinction between the two symbols was still well recognized, with A.H. Burkitt writing in On Tradesmen's Signs of London, "We find Mercury, or his caduceus, appropriate in trade as indicating expedition. Aesculapius, his serpent and staff, or his cock, for professors of the healing art." Indeed, the modern confusion between the caduceus and the staff of Asclepius seems to have originated in the United States around the 1850s. In 1856, the caduceus was adopted by the United States Marine Service to indicate its members' status as peaceful non-combatants, drawing upon its association with communication, mediation, and honesty. The next year, the symbol was also adopted by the United States Army Medical Corps for use by hospital stewards who were not doctors but performed a variety of supporting duties in army hospitals. Later, in 1871, John M. Woodworth, the first United States Surgeon General, chose the caduceus as the seal of the Marine Hospital Service, which in 1912 would become the United States Public Health Service. The reason for this choice is unclear, with some sources claiming it was a purely aesthetic decision, the caduceus being more symmetrical and visually pleasing than the staff of Asclepius, while others claim the symbol was simply a carryover from the Marine Service. Whatever the case, in 1902, the caduceus became the official crest of the United States Army Medical Corps, further adding to the confusion. This choice is often blamed on the ignorance of one Captain Frederick P. Reynolds, who petitioned Surgeon General Brigadier General William H. Forward to adopt the caduceus as the symbol of the Corps. However, as an article in the June 28, 1902 issue of the Army and Navy Register points out, Reynolds was well aware of the difference between the two symbols and deliberately chose the caduceus on the basis that the rod represents power, the serpents stand for wisdom, and the two wings imply diligence and activity, qualities which are undoubtedly possessed by our medical officers. Similarly, many sources claim that another key figure in the symbol's adoption, Colonel John R. Van Hoff, was unaware of the difference between the caduceus and the staff of Asclepius. But as William K. Emerson explains in the Encyclopedia of United States Army Insignia and Uniforms, the sign of Mercury was deliberately adopted, as I have heard Van Hoff state, because it was the emblem of the merchant and hence the emblem of the non-combatant. The caduceus in our use of it is not distinctly the emblem of the physician, but the emblem of the whole medical department. The enlisted men of the medical department outnumber the physicians of that department. Both the enlisted men and the vehicles of the department, not to mention many other objects, should bear some sign of neutralization for protection. It seemed to Colonel Hoff and to the board that the Geneva Cross, which in addition to its use as an emblem of neutrality is also the emblem of the Swiss Republic, there might well be substituted created an emblem which is not the emblem of a foreign country, and the caduceus was selected as the emblem which for many ages has served to indicate the non-combatant. Strangely, while the US Army Medical Corps continues to use the caduceus as a symbol, the Army Medical Department, to which it belongs, uses the staff of Asclepius, as does the Medical Department of the US Air Force. For a time, the American Medical Association used the caduceus as its symbol, but in 1912, after considerable discussion, this was changed to the staff of Asclepius. Today, the vast majority of professional medical associations prefer the traditional staff of Asclepius, while the caduceus is most widely associated with commercial enterprises such as pharmaceutical companies and the manufacturers of medical equipment and first aid supplies. Indeed, a 1990 survey in the United States found that the caduceus was used by only 37% of professional associations, but a full 76% of commercial organizations. Given the traditional association between the caduceus and commerce, this can hardly be a coincidence. And now for a bonus fact. Another common medical symbol with an unclear origin is the RX symbol used by doctors and pharmacists to indicate a prescription. The most common explanation is that the symbol is simply an abbreviation of the Latin word recipe, meaning to take, which is also the root of the modern English word recipe. Indeed, several other traditional medical abbreviations also take this form, including DX for diagnosis, SX for signs and symptoms, and HX for history. A more exotic theory, however, holds that the symbol is derived from an ancient Egyptian symbol called the Eye of Horus. In ancient Egyptian mythology, Osiris, god of the underworld, was betrayed and murdered by his evil brother Set, who dismembered Osiris's body and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Horus, son of Osiris, and the goddess Isis sought revenge on his uncle, and in the ensuing battle, Set gouged Horus's eye out. Isis brought the eye to Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, who repaired the organ and imbued it with magic. Horus then used the eye to bring Osiris, whose pieces have been diligently gathered and reassembled by Isis, back to life. For centuries, the Eye of Horus was associated with healing and protection, and according to the theory, gradually evolved into its current simplified form. However, while poetic, there is little concrete evidence for this particular origin story. A more likely alternate explanation is that the symbol derives from the astrological symbol for Jupiter, the Roman name for Zeus. As William Osler, one of the founders of Johns Hopkins Hospital, explained in 1910, this symbol was often used by Roman physicians in order to elicit the god's favor in healing their patients. Quote, "In a cursive form, it is found in medieval translations of the works of Ptolemy, the astrologer, as the sign of the planet Jupiter. As such, it was placed upon horoscopes and upon formula containing drugs made for administration to the body, so that the harmful properties of these drugs might be removed under the influence of the lucky planet." Another theory holds that the symbol became popular during Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians during the 1st century AD, used by physicians as an expression of loyalty to the old Roman pantheon. But as with many ancient symbols and traditions, the precise origin of RX is unknown. The true explanation may be any of the previous, or all three, or just maybe something else entirely. There's an old joke told in natural history museums about a new tour guide showing around a group of visitors. Stopping before a dinosaur skeleton, he informs the group that the fossil remains are 80 million years and 3 weeks old. "How do you know that?" asks one of the visitors. "Because it was 80 million when I started," says the guide, "and I've been here 3 weeks." Ba-da-bum-bum. So, how do we really know how old fossils like dinosaur bones are? For hundreds of years, the answer lay in stratigraphy, the study of strata or rock layers first pioneered by Nicholas Steno and William Smith in the 17th and 18th centuries. Fossils form when biological remains become enveloped in mud, sand, seafloor sludge, or other kinds of sediment, which slowly accumulates over time and is transformed into sedimentary rock such as shale, sandstone, or limestone by the intense weight of subsequent sediment layers. The relative ages of fossils can thus be determined by their position in the stratigraphic column, with younger remains at the top and older remains at the bottom. However, this method is extremely imprecise, as determining even the relative ages of fossils requires knowledge of the rate at which the original sediment was deposited, something that can only be very roughly estimated. In many cases, there may be significant pauses in sedimentation, known as hiatuses, during which sediment layers may be eroded away before sedimentation begins anew. Entire sections of sequential strata can also be displaced, distorted, or even destroyed by geological geological processes, further confusing the geologic timeline. For example, over much of North America, the glaciers of the last ice age scraped away much of the continent's geological formations down to the Ordovician and Devonian periods of around 400 million years ago, leaving only scattered pockets of younger strata. Thus, stratigraphy alone can only provide a rough estimate of the relative ages of various fossils. To determine their absolute age, paleontologists must instead turn to the more precise science of radiometric dating. As the name implies, radiometric dating relies on the phenomenon of radioactivity. Radioactivity is the process whereby an atom, due to either an excess or imbalance of protons and neutrons in its nucleus, becomes unstable and starts to decay in an attempt to reach a more stable, low-energy state. There are three main types of radioactive decay. Alpha decay, in which the nucleus ejects an alpha particle consisting of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Beta decay, in which a neutron is transformed into a proton, a beta particle or electron, and a neutrino, the latter of which are ejected. And then there is gamma radiation, which accompanies beta decay and results in the emission of a high-energy photon or gamma ray. With each decay event, the atom is transformed into an entirely new element, a process known as transmutation, until a stable, non-radioactive isotope is reached. For example, the common radioactive isotope uranium-238 slowly transforms via a 14-step decay chain into the stable isotope lead-206. The rate at which a radioactive isotope decays is measured by its half-life, the statistical measure of how long it takes for half of the atoms in a particular sample to decay. This decay rate is extremely regular. In fact, it is one of the most regular processes known in nature and cannot be slowed down or sped up by any physical process such as changes in temperature or chemical reactions. Radioactive decay thus provides scientists with an ideal clock with which to measure the age of the Earth. The most well-known form of radiometric dating is the radiocarbon or carbon-14 method developed by Willard F. Libby in 1952. The element carbon-14 is produced via the bombardment of nitrogen by cosmic rays in the upper atmosphere and accounts for less than 1/1000% of carbon atoms found in nature. Though it is radioactive with a half-life of 5,730 years, this decay is balanced out by production, meaning that the proportion of carbon-14 to the more common carbon-12 in nature remains relatively stable. In the form of carbon dioxide, carbon-14 is absorbed by plants and then by the animals that eat them, and so on up the food chain, such that the concentration of carbon-14 in most organisms is roughly that's in the atmosphere. When an organism dies, however, it stops absorbing carbon and the radiometric stopwatch is started. As time passes, the carbon-14 inside the organism's remains slowly decays away, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 gradually skewing away from that of the surrounding environment. When organic remains are excavated, this ratio can be measured, and since the half-life of carbon-14 is known, the time elapsed since the organism's death can be determined. This is similar to how you can figure out how long an hourglass has been running, provided you know the flow rate of the sand and how much sand was in the top and bottom when it was turned over. While widely used in archaeology and paleontology, radiocarbon has a number of major limitations. For example, while the technique is based on the assumption that atmospheric carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio has remained steady throughout history, examination of tree rings has revealed that this ratio has varied over time. The most significant of these variations began in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when the carbon dioxide generated by burning coal and oil diluted the carbon-14 ratio, and in the 1950s, when above-ground nuclear testing released large amounts of carbon-14 into the atmosphere. This latter source has created a major contamination problem, and archaeologists must be careful when gathering samples so as not to contaminate them with newer, more carbon-14 rich material. Other factors which can throw off the accuracy of radiocarbon dating include volcanic eruptions, immersion in mineral-rich water, or immersion at the bottom of the ocean, all of which serve to distort the average atmospheric carbon ratio. But the greatest limitation of radiocarbon dating is the timescale over which it can be applied. Generally speaking, radiocarbon dating is only useful up to around 50,000 years in the past which the carbon-14 ratio becomes too small to accurately measure. For older remains, like those of dinosaurs, other methods are required. Among the most common methods for dating fossil remains is the potassium-argon series. The isotope potassium-14, found in many different minerals, decays into stable argon-14 with a half-life of 1.2 billion years. Argon, being a noble gas, does not react or bind with other atoms in its parent mineral and simply accumulates within it. When that mineral melts into magma, however, the argon escapes, bringing the argon-potassium ratio to 0 and resetting the radiometric clock. Once the mineral cools and solidifies either in the form of lava or volcanic ash, the potassium inside continues to decay and argon begins to accumulate once more. Going back to the hourglass analogy, this is like opening the bottom of the hourglass and allowing the sand in the bottom chamber to spill out. By measuring the argon-potassium ratio today, geologists can determine the time elapsed since the mineral was last melted down and solidified. Of course, this method is only applicable to igneous rocks, whereas fossils are only found in sedimentary deposits. However, where these two mineral types are found in close proximity to each other, radiometric dating of the igneous rocks can be used to estimate the age of fossils in the sedimentary strata. One region in which potassium-argon dating is particularly useful is in strata left over from the Western Interior Seaway, a large, shallow inland sea that covered much of central North America around 100 to 70 million years ago during the late Cretaceous period. These formations, found mostly in the Midwestern United States and Canada, consist mainly of black shale, the remains of seafloor sediments, layered with a clay-like mineral called bentonite. Bentonite is composed of volcanic ash from the eruption of volcanoes on the seashore, and being igneous in origin can be potassium-argon dated. If the bentonite layers above and below a particular stratum are dated, then a very accurate age for any fossils found within that stratum can be found. Another common method for dating extremely old minerals is the uranium-lead series, which relies on the decay chain of both uranium-238 and the rarer isotope uranium-235. Uranium-lead dating is most commonly applied to the mineral zircon, which readily incorporates uranium into its crystal structure but strongly rejects lead, meaning that any lead found within the zircon comes from the decay of the trapped uranium. This natural resetting of the radiometric clock can thus be used to determine the time elapsed since the mineral first formed. In 2017, this method was used to identify the oldest minerals ever found on Earth, 4.4 billion-year-old zircons discovered in the Jack Hills of Western Australia. Uranium decay inside crystals also forms the basis of another common radiometric method called fission track dating. In addition to regular alpha decay, uranium atoms sometimes undergo spontaneous fission, splitting into a number of high-energy fragments called fission products. These fragments damage the crystal structure on their way out, leaving tiny tracks that can be easily seen with a microscope. As the spontaneous fission rate of uranium is known and fission tracks are easily erased by heating, counting these tracks can reveal the timing of high-temperature events such as volcanic eruptions, and this technique is thus often used to verify the results of potassium-argon dating. However, it is important to note that geologists and paleontologists must be extremely careful when applying these and other radiometric dating methods, as certain crystals like zircons are extremely resilient and can often find themselves eroded out of the minerals in which they formed and incorporated into newer sedimentary or igneous formations. In this case, the datable minerals within a stratum may be significantly older than the stratum itself. As is often the case in geology, context is key. There are many other radiometric dating methods, including the uranium thorium, rubidium strontium, and samarium neodymium series, but all work according to the same basic principles. In summary, the age of fossil remains, like dinosaur bones, is not determined from the fossils themselves, but from other, often igneous minerals deposited at the same time. However, this does not mean that stratigraphy is obsolete. Radiometric dating is a highly technical and often expensive process, and it is not feasible to independently date every individual fossil. Instead, once the age of a particular stratum or formation is determined, then any fossils found within that formation can be assumed to be of roughly the same age. Indeed, paleontologists often make use of so-called index fossils, organisms of a known age characteristic to a particular formation or geologic period, to estimate the age of new species found within that same formation. Together, radiometric dating and stratigraphy can yield surprisingly precise results, the uranium-lead series being capable of pinpointing the age of a mineral to within an astonishing 250,000 years. Not enough for an inexperienced museum tour guide, perhaps, but more than good enough for paleontologists.
Regardless of your feelings about the overall quality of the film itself, you have to admit that for a movie released in 1993, Jurassic Park contains some mighty fine-looking dinosaurs. In fact, the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park look so good, many film critics and fans contend that the film's CGI effects still hold up today, nearly 3 decades later, with some even going so far as to say that they look better than scenes in more recent Jurassic Park films. The funny thing about that, however, is that while Jurassic Park is often singled out for its groundbreaking CGI, there are actually very few moments in the film that were were realized using such newfangled technology. You see, despite being some 127 minutes long, Jurassic Park contains a mere 14 minutes of on-camera dinosaur action, with a huge number of scenes seeming to contain dinosaurs in the action, actually having the dinosaurs doing their thing off-camera, with specific quick-cut sound effects and actor and scene elements like plant life, cups of water, etc., making the dinosaurs' presence known and felt in the scenes, even though you don't actually see them. As for those 14 minutes, the dinos do appear on camera, only 5 to 6 minutes were realized using CGI. The rest were retrieved via everything from a full-size, just under 5-ton, extremely realistic-looking and moving T-Rex to dudes running around in very realistic-looking Velociraptor costumes. Or put it another way, the film that is considered the gold standard for awesome CGI achieved this acclaim via doing everything possible not to use CGI, and in the few minutes they did use it, doing an awful lot to encourage viewers to not pay too close attention to the CGI elements, as you'll soon see when we get into specific examples. You see, Spielberg initially wanted no CGI whatsoever for the film. His plan for the dinosaur effects in Jurassic Park was to accomplish it all via a combination of stop motion and animatronics, with the former to be handled by stop motion wizard Phil Tippett, then an Oscar winner for his work in Return of the Jedi, and the latter to be handled by special effects guru Stan Winston, then a recent recipient of a couple of Academy Awards for his work in Terminator 2, as well as previously winning one for his work in Alien. The idea being that Winston and his team would create animatronic dinosaurs and appropriate costumes and the like to be used for close-ups, while Tippett and his team would handle the long shots where motion that couldn't easily be achieved by other methods was needed. Spielberg was reportedly highly resistant to the idea of using any CGI, primarily because he believed it would look fake given the technology of the day and ruin the film. Remember, this was an era when Windows 3.1 was the bee's knees and Microsoft's game-changing Clippy was still just a futuristic dream. That should put things in perspective. However, the wizards at George Lucas's industrial light and magic were rather ahead of their time in a lot of ways and decided not to take no for an answer, creating a demo which they could convince Spielberg with. In order to ensure they'd convince him with this demo, they set about creating the hardest shot they could think of, a T-Rex walking directly toward the camera in broad daylight with nothing hidden. This footage was then screened to Spielberg and members of the effects crew, including both Winston and Tippett. According to those present that day, the reaction from everyone was one of complete shock, with Tippett perhaps most affected of all, as he was essentially witnessing the obsolescence of a huge amount of his expertise. As he would later state, the change was devastating. I had different concessions, and all of a sudden, the plug was pulled. At the time, he simply turned to Spielberg and stated, "I think I'm extinct." This was the direct inspiration for the line in the film in which Dr. Grant says, "I think we're out of a job," and Malcolm then says, "Don't you mean extinct?" At this point, Spielberg was partially on board. However, critically, and a lesson lost on many a director then until now, was that Spielberg still only wanted to use this technology when there was no other way to achieve the scene better with either practical effects or, in many cases, simply having the thing that would otherwise need CGI seeming to be in the scene but not actually showing up on camera at all. For example, consider perhaps the most famous sequence in the entire film, the nighttime T-Rex attack on the Jeeps. In this, the majority of the time, the T-Rex's presence is more or less felt off camera, with this all augmented by generally quick cuts between the very real life-size version of the T-Rex and, when needed, a CGI version of the same. With regards to the former, beyond being created to move in extremely realistic ways, the life-size version that appeared on camera was also extremely helpful to the digital animators, as it not only gave them a model to mimic, but also helped them do things like achieve perfectly consistent lighting in the scene and the like. On top of that, during that scene, there's a shot where the T-Rex is distracted by a torch and a CGI version of itself walks away from the camera, something the real thing couldn't do. If you watch the moment in question, you'll notice that every step the T-Rex takes shakes the camera and vehicle the cameras are sitting inside of. It's a minor detail, sure, but it's one that not only briefly blurs the visuals a little as the dinosaur is moving, somewhat masking the CGI's weaknesses, but also sells you on the idea that the thing you're seeing is actually there, or using a subtle and very easy to achieve practical effect. On that note, effects supervisor Dennis Muren, who won an Oscar for his work on the film, would later note in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter that a key aspect of what made the CGI dinosaurs in Jurassic Park seem so real is that he and his team gave them a sense of weight and gravity. For an example of a scene where proper weight and gravity isn't given to a CGI character, go watch this scene from the 2014 Transformers Age of Extinction and notice how not a single thing on screen other than the human moves in response to a 30-ton robot backflipping into frame and firing a giant machine gun gun into the air. Even the shipping container the giant robot lands on doesn't show any signs of having said massive being curb stomp it, other than a few fake-looking CGI sparks. While you might not consciously register this, the subtle effect is that while in many ways the CGI on this film is light years ahead of the original Jurassic Park, because of poor direction and production, it seems much less real looking when nothing in frame is physically reacting to the otherwise very realistic looking CGI object. In contrast to the Michael Bay directed Transformers, in Jurassic Park, beyond things like the aforementioned camera shake, we have other samples like when a CGI version of the T-Rex steps on the Jeep, it squishes it into the mud and crushes the physical object appropriately. That not only makes it seem more like a real dinosaur in the scene, but simultaneously draws your eyes, the people being crushed underneath, to see what's happening to them, and away from paying attention to the CGI dinosaur, thus both getting around some of the limitations of CGI at the time and adding an awful lot of tension to the scene to boot. Along with often not showing the dinosaurs, also as a way to increase tension, in a nutshell, this was all taking a weakness of technology of the era and making it a strength of the film, a master director just showing off, basically. And then, in the other scenes, instead of using a CGI dinosaur, which many a modern director would default to, instead they cut to a shot of a physical 30-foot-tall animatronic dinosaur headbutting its way into a jeep full of screaming actors who are all reacting to the same, very real thing at once. If you read up on many an interview with Stan Winston on this, he maintains that the beauty of practical effects instead of CGI is that the reaction they inspire from actors is more real, which audiences do pick up on, even if not fully consciously registering the subtle difference. On the flip side, Winston also is quick to point out the limitations of his craft. For example, a weakness of animatronic models and practical effects is that they're often unwieldy, and in specific regards the animatronic model dinosaurs featured in Jurassic Park, not all that nimble at times. Although, if you go watch the footage of the movements of the near 5-ton T-Rex his team made, it seems rather shockingly nimble in our opinion, and its realistic movements are incredible. Whatever your opinion there, another trick used in that rather famous T-Rex attacking the Jeep sequence is to both set it at night and in the rain to help obscure the limitations of both the practical and digital effects. A similar example is that of the kitchen scene, which shows a bunch of velociraptors trying to nibble on the Unix user and her brother. First, the scene is intentionally not well lit, with lots of shadows and quick cut scenes showing only bits of the dinosaurs. From there, believe it or not, much of the scene was shot not using CGI, but using some guys in very realistic looking velociraptor costumes. CGI was only used for a few select moments that were too difficult for the stunt guys, such as jumping into the air onto the counter. This is one of the least realistic looking scenes of the film when you watch it really closely, but in the moment, the way things are cut and shot and the elements that draw your eye, it comes off looking extremely realistic. You just don't notice the dinosaur doesn't look nearly as good as the split second before or after, or when they were using the dudes in costumes. This ensures the audience is never completely taken out of the scene, unlike, say, the 2001 The Mummy Returns, where the Scorpion King looks laughably fake during the final fight, almost completely ruining the climax of the film. A particularly odd choice, given that The Rock is already capable of being a rather terrifying hulk of a beast without needing CGI to achieve that effect. Or perhaps another great example of this is the difference between the massively better looking 1983 Return of the Jedi Jabba the Hutt versus Jabba's cameo in the 1997 special edition of A New Hope. In the former, Jabba looks incredibly realistic because, well, it's a real thing being shot in somewhat dim lighting in many scenes to boot. In the latter, he is featured completely CGI in broad daylight, with the effect being that he looks incredibly fake to the point that it's shocking that someone didn't smack George Lucas on the nose with a rolled up newspaper and say, "No, George! No!" Going back to Jurassic Park, a contrasting example is the film's final action sequence, in which the T-Rex gets in a fight with the Velociraptors. As you might expect, this scene is realised almost entirely with CGI, and with much better lighting than many other CGI scenes in the film, which could potentially be a problem. However, a number of tricks were used to get around those issues. For example, to add that, to quote, wait, subtle things do occur which make the dinosaur seem more real. For instance, at one point, instead of having a raptor jump from up high down to the ground directly, the CGI raptor is instead made to jump onto the skeleton of a T-Rex, with the very real prop shaking and breaking appropriately in response. Similarly, rather than having the CGI dinosaurs going at it with little interaction with their environment, at one point the T-Rex throws a raptor into the physical skeleton, with, again, the physical object made to react just like it would if that had really happened, once again subtly making the scene feel more real than if the T-Rex had just thrown the raptor across the room without hitting anything but the unyielding floor. If you really pay attention to this scene, there are numerous subtle cues like this used with the CGI dinosaurs constantly affecting real physical objects. This is all combined with extremely quick cuts and pans away from the CGI dinosaurs, as well as an occasional object coming in between you and being able to see said dinosaurs. The net effect being to make them seem like they are in frame a lot longer and more than they actually are. For example, at one point a CGI raptor is only in a scene for about 2 seconds as it leaps toward the humans, and in that extremely brief shot, when it lands, it accidentally kicks a bone on the floor and then mostly stops moving at all for the rest of the scene. The instant it mostly stops moving, the camera very quickly pans away, following the actors running away, which combined with the kicked physical object all draws your eye away from the oddly, mostly motionless CGI dinosaur. Another factor that made the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park seem so realistic is that while Phil Tippett didn't get to make any stop-motion footage for the film as originally planned, he did serve as a supervisor. Why is this important? Well, digital effects artists working for Industrial Light and Magic would later note that Tippett's literal decades of experience working with animal motions was an invaluable resource for helping make the dinosaurs seem to move in realistic ways. It was also key in ensuring uniformity of movement and behavior between the team working on the animatronic dinosaurs and the one working on the CGI ones. On that note, as a brief aside, Phil Tippett's officially credited role in the production of Jurassic Park was that of dinosaur supervisor, with many a joke being made about this later, like, "One job, Phil, you had one job," referencing the fact that despite his supervision, the dinosaurs in the film were constantly running amok. Now, going back to the benefit of having the physical dinos, as alluded to, critically, unlike a film relying exclusively on CGI for various elements, the digital animators had those physical dinos on camera in several scenes to build off in the scenes themselves. This helped the cuts back and forth between CGI dinosaurs and the physical ones be extremely seamless, despite the limitations of the technology of the age. Yet another subtle difference that's often suggested for making the CGI in Jurassic Park look objectively better than some CGI seen even in movies today is that the movie didn't make any use of unnatural color grading. This is extensively used, and many say massively overused, in some modern films. While it can be of benefit in certain sequences or films to achieve a specific effect or feeling to the scene, perhaps most famously and appropriately used in films like The Matrix and Oh Brother Where Art Thou, overly aggressive, ubiquitous digital color grading can sometimes make a movie or scene look slightly unnatural, which in some cases makes the CGI it contains also seem more unnatural than it would have. Thus, it is argued that Jurassic Park, in contrast, has a bit more of a realistic feel because the world they exist in looks just like our own in coloration. For example, no overlay of a slight blue tint, which is frequent in Jurassic World. As author David Bell notes of this is why the effects in The Avengers and Dawn of the Planet of the Apes look so darn good in comparison. Along with dumping tons of money into CGI, these movies didn't wash everything over with color grading to make it look like Middle-earth. It's the actual world with actual Earth tones. Now, whatever your opinion on that last point, to sum up, the reason the CGI looks so good in the original Jurassic Park is paradoxically because the film purposefully used CGI as little as possible and in very specific ways to mask its limitations. And as for this masterful masking, beyond keeping the dinos off camera a shocking amount when you really pay attention, or while seeming to be in the scene when you're just watching it in the moment, it helped that those behind the film more or less made up a dream team of effects artists, all under the direct supervision of one of the most talented directors in Hollywood history. And, well, it showed, didn't it?
People have been referencing sentient reptilian entities, sometimes humanoid, sometimes not, going back to some of the earliest written works and legends known to man. In more modern times, according to a survey done by the firm Public Policy Polling, approximately 4% of Americans queried claimed that they believed lizard people are influencing world politics, with an additional 7% on the fence about this question. So, how did the idea of lizard people ruling the world start? Well, to begin with, for those unfamiliar with our lizard overlords, while there are a variety of versions of this conspiracy theory, the general notion is that a few different types of reptilian humanoids walk among us. Chief among these creatures are a type speculated to come from the Draco constellation, because apparently the lizard people knew their little corner of the galaxy would look vaguely like a serpent from Earth when connecting the dots during a certain part of Earth's history, and so went ahead and spent millions of years
years evolving appropriately on their home planet to match. The Draconians are apparently tall, winged, reptilian humanoids who not only secretly rule over humans, but more overtly rule over other types of lizard people as well. As for those others, the second most prominent group widely held among adherents to this conspiracy are the shape-shifting human-reptilian hybrids. Naturally, thanks to the fact that the lizard people are secretly working to control humanity, many former and current prominent world leaders, such as the now allegedly deceased Queen Elizabeth II, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump, along with celebrities like Angelina Jolie, the allegedly deceased Betty White, Simon Whistler, and Katy Perry, are all known to be shape-shifting reptoids. As to why said reptoids wish to rule the world, there are a variety of reasons given, with the most prominent two being that they are here for our gold, and alternatively, that they feed on negative energy from humans, particularly given off when we're afraid, angry, or just generally anxious. Thus, they wish to create an Orwellian world government system in order to more easily manipulate our collective emotions for their own sustenance. This now brings us to who actually first came up with the modern idea of these reptilian overlords in the first place. While, as noted, sentient reptilians of some form or another have seemingly been around in human legend for as long as we've been humaning, one of the earliest and most influential references of lizard people in more modern times can be found in Robert E. Howard's 1929 story The Shadow Kingdom, published in the pulp magazine Weird Tales. Not coincidentally, these beings are shockingly similar to the modern perception of lizard people. In a nutshell, the story involves ancient shape-shifting reptilian humanoids with elaborate underground abodes who work in the shadows to rule humanity, including via infiltrating various groups and using mind control to influence world politics. This and subsequent works by Howard would go on to popularize some version of these lizard people, including in works by a close friend of his, H.P. Lovecraft. The concept caught on from here and has shown no signs of stopping in science fiction since. Noteworthy here, for reasons we'll get to in a bit, is one individual, Mystic Correspondence School founder Maurice Doreal, who would seemingly be inspired by Howard's lizard people when creating many written works for his followers, most notably the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. Except in Doreal's case, he would use these science fiction characters to create a supposed real history of Earth that incorporates reptoids as factual beings. Because, sure, why not? Another notable incident that helped spread the idea of lizard people occurred in 1934 and 1935 when one G. Warren Shufelt was looking for gold in California. To aid in his endeavor, Shufelt invented a device that he claimed used radio X-rays to see deep into the Earth and was apparently able to be used to find precious metals like gold as well. Of course, his device didn't actually use X-rays, but rather used a common dowsing pendulum, as described in a January 29, 1934 edition of the Los Angeles Times. Quoting here, Schufelt's radio device consists chiefly of a cylindrical glass case inside of which a plummet attached to a copper wire held by the engineer sways continually, pointing, he asserts, toward minerals or tunnels below the surface of the ground, and then revolves when over mineral or swings in prolongation of the tunnel when above the excavation. Using the device, the Times piece reveals a rather astounding discovery made by Shufelt. Busy Los Angeles, although little realizing it in the hustle and bustle of modern existence, stands above a lost city of catacombs filled with incalculable treasure and imperishable records of a race of humans further advanced intellectually and scientifically than even the highest type of present-day peoples. Shufelt himself goes on of this discovery, "I knew I was over a pattern of tunnels, and I had mapped out the course of the tunnels, the position of large rooms scattered along the tunnel route, as well as the position of deposits of gold, but I couldn't understand the meaning of it." Shufelt made a breakthrough, however, when he came across a Hopi Native American who went by the name of Little Chief Greenleaf, as well as L. Macklin. Shufelt claims that Greenleaf told him about 5,000 years ago in Hopi history. It speaks of lizard people who built vast underground cities in the region, recording their own history on gold tablets. Hearing this story, Shufelt connected the dots and believed he had found one of these cities, and could prove it because within the chambers he found, to quote, "gold tablets with perfect corners, sides, and ends, scientific proof of the gold's existence." Of course, given that he was using nothing more than a dowsing pendulum, it's not really clear how he could have detected anything, let alone gold tablets hundreds of feet below the Earth's surface. And we're not really sure how claiming you found gold is scientific proof of finding gold, but he was happy to take investors' money to pursue the dig. On that note, with the story being published in newspapers across the country, Shufelt was able to both garner city support for the project in exchange for 50% of any gold found, as well as get sufficient money from investors to start excavating. Unfortunately for his investors, as often happens when you dig deep holes, the result is eventually encountering water, with the project ultimately stopping at a depth of about 350 feet because of this complication. While Shufelt had thus successfully accomplished drilling a well, sadly he did not manage to find any buried treasure. As to what happened to him after, he doesn't appear to have used his radio X-ray device on any other projects and more or less disappeared from history, other than it being recorded that he died in California in 1957. As to the Hoppy legends that he used to garner so much support for his project, it should be noted here that while this story is often used as support of the existence of the lizard people, beyond the fact that no such tunnels were ever found, it is explicitly noted in accounts from Shufelt at the time that these were humans who simply used the lizard as their symbol. And indeed, while there is no known Hoppy legend about literal lizard people, it was common for the Hoppy to have clans that used animal names, such as a bear clan, a spider clan, and, most pertinent to the topic at hand, yes, there really was a lizard clan. As the rest of the story concerning underground cities and technologically advanced peoples, there is no known reference to this in any surviving Hoppy legends. Of course, given their history was passed down orally, much was lost before their stories started to be written down. That said, further raising questions about Shufelt's story is that there is no record of a Chief Greenleaf or El Macklin in any surviving Hoppy birth and death record. Of course, while extensive, these lists are not comprehensive, so it's possible Greenleaf really did exist. But as with the supposed Hoppy legend of these advanced lizard people, all we have to go on is Shufelt's word. Whether Shufelt was simply a con artist or he legitimately believed vast tunnels filled with gold exist under the city of Los Angeles isn't clear. Either way, his claims are occasionally used as proof of ancient lizard people inhabiting the Earth. Fast forwarding to 1976, and we have the 12th Planet and subsequent similar works by Zecharia Sitchin, where he purports that beings known as the Anunnaki from the planet Nibiru came to Earth 500,000 years ago in order to acquire, to quote here, monoatomic gold, which they can use for traveling through dimensions, among other things. Thankfully for us humans who were used as slaves by the Anunnaki, this group ended up hightailing it off Earth because of a great flood that covered the planet. When the Anunnaki came back, they apparently were involved in the building of a variety of ancient structures, such as the pyramids. Noteworthy here is that Sitchin's Anunnaki weren't necessarily reptilian, but, as with Shufelt's story, would later be folded into the lizard people conspiracy theory anyway. And this finally brings us to the man of the hour, and arguably the greatest driving force behind the modern lizard people conspiracy theory, as well as perhaps the most successful professional conspiracy theorist of all time, David Vaughan Icke. Icke was a former popular sportscaster for the BBC and prominent Green Party member. His life changed, however, around 1990 when he started feeling some invisible presence which physically led him to a book called Mind to Mind, written by a psychic healer by the name of Betty Shine. Soon enough, he sought out Shine to see if she could shed a little light on how he might heal his arthritis and what the deal was with the strange presence that he was encountering. After a few visits, Shine allegedly told him on March the 29th, 1990, that Icke was placed on Earth to work as the instrument of the spirit world, and they would be contacting him to use him as a conduit to help humanity. Shortly after this, messages flooded in. In order to spare the Green Party the controversy he knew would follow when he revealed to the world what the spirit realm was telling him, in 1991, Icke decided to leave said political party. He then held a press conference alongside his wife, Linda Atherton, and his girlfriend, Deborah Shaw. Okay. Announcing to the world that he was, in fact, the son of a godhead, with godhead described by Icke as infinite mind. Among other things, he would make a variety of bold predictions, such as that the world would experience a cataclysmic event in 1997, which would see such things as New Zealand disappearing into the sea. This would all culminate in the entire world ceasing to exist. He further revealed that all of this was told to him by spirit voices who were using him as a conduit to communicate to the people of Earth. While it expected controversy from these revelations, apparently the reality of people not only not believing him, but actually mocking him quite openly across the country was too much at first for Icke. He stated, "One of my very greatest fears as a child was being ridiculed in public. And there it was, coming true. As a television presenter, I'd been respected. People come up to you in the street and shake your hand and talk to you in a respectful way. And suddenly, overnight, this was transformed into Icke's a nutter. I couldn't walk down any street in Britain without being laughed at. It was a nightmare. My children were devastated because their dad was a figure of ridicule." At one point shortly after his infamous announcement to the world, many dozens of teens even went went so far as to gather in front of his house, continually chanting, "We want the Messiah, give us a sign, David." Despite it all, Ike soldiered on anyway, writing several astoundingly well-reviewed books such as The Truth Shall Set You Free, The Truth Vibrations, The Children of the Matrix, The Biggest Secret, The Book That Will Change the World, Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center, and Infinite Love is the Only Truth, among many others, with the entire catalogue having apparently sold a couple of 100,000 copies to date. On the side, Ike also sells merchandise, operates a surprisingly popular conspiracy theory website, and most lucratively of all, frequently gives public talks in front of crowds of thousands, in one instance in Australia, apparently grossing a whopping £83,000 or $102,000 in ticket sales. At a talk in Melbourne. I'm in the wrong business! As for lizard people, they're at the centre of Ike's vast conspiracy theory, which pretty much forges elements from just about every prominent conspiracy theory into one master theory to rule them all. Noteworthy is that much of the modern mythos surrounding the lizard people Ike has channeled from the spirit realm bears shocking resemblance to the sci-fi stories that kicked off the whole lizard people idea in the first place, as well as seemingly borrowing from the aforementioned The Emerald Tablets, as well as Stitchin's work, among others. Not completely unoriginal, Ike has come up with a number of his own elements to add to the narrative, including claiming the lizard people use the moon, which apparently is a spacecraft and interdimensional portal, to project a holographic reality to aid in controlling humans. In his own words, "We are living in a dream world within a dream world, a matrix within a virtual reality universe, and it is being broadcast from the moon. Unless people force themselves to become fully conscious, their minds are the moon's minds." I wonder why everyone was calling you a nutter, David. I wonder, David. He later claimed that actually the rings of Saturn were where these signals originated, with the moon itself merely amplifying and projecting them onto Earth. Which, I'm not going to lie, shape-shifting interdimensional lizard aliens invading Earth using mind control, virtual reality, moon-sized spacecraft, and many other awesome technologies to take over the world. I mean, I'd watch that movie. Can we get someone to sum up Ike's books into one coherent trilogy and add some awesome characters and maybe get the Wachowskis to direct it, please? Of course, in Ike's version of things, it's not Keanu Reeves who'd save the world, but of course, it's himself. I mean, he's the son of a godhead after all, and he'll reveal the truth to the world and get everyone to love one another. Ike states, "David and rule is the bottom line of all dictatorships. Arab is turned against Jew, black against white, right against left. Unplugging from the matrix means refusing to recognize these illusory fault lines. We are all one. I refuse to see a Jew as different from an Arab and vice versa. They are both expressions of the one and need to be observed and treated the same, none more or less important than the other. I refuse to see black people in terms that I would not see white, nor to see the left as I would not see the right. How could it be any different, except when we believe the illusion of division is real? If we do that, the Matrix has us." He sums up in a speech in 2012, "If we want a world of love and peace, we have to be loving and peaceful with everyone, even people we don't like." In the end, that is, according to the spirit realm, who is using Ike to communicate with us, the only way to defeat the lizard people. Starve them of our anxieties, fears, and angers, and give them only the positive energy of love. So to sum up, lizard people in some form or another have been around seemingly as long as humans have been coming up with stories, with the modern incarnation mostly seeming to have been popularized by author Robert E. Howard, spreading through fiction from there, and ultimately adapted, among other works, by others, with this all culminating in the most prominent version of the lizard people story created by the son of a godhead, Britain's own David Icke. We're not proud. For full details, see the many books which the lizard people freely allow him to publish, despite that the books reveal their ultra-secret plan in incredible detail, and even out some of the most prominent members. And now for a bonus fact. Speaking of conspiracy theories, have you ever wondered why Area 51 is thought to house alien bodies and technologies? Well, wonder no more. First, it's important to realize what Area 51 actually is. For all intents and purposes, and according to every government document ever released, Area 51 is a so-called secret military base where they test experimental pieces of military hardware. For example, experimental jets such as the SR-71 Blackbird and the Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady were tested at the Area 51 base, the latter of which was actually the first piece of hardware publicly known to have been constructed and tested there. The site Area 51 was built on was supposedly first chosen due to the incredibly smooth lands found on nearby lake beds, coupled with the area's natural inaccessibility. Both of these features made it perfect for testing aircraft like the Lockheed U-2, which required a large area of flat land from which it could take off and land, while at the same time required being in an area of enemies that the US couldn't at the time easily lay their peepers on. Understandably, for a location that deals in incredibly sensitive military information that costs billions to produce, the government has a real hard-on for keeping it secret. Over the years, this hasn't exactly panned out. For example, on April the 19th, 1974, astronauts taking part in a Skylab mission accidentally photographed the airfield at Groom Lake being an alternative name for Area 51. The funny part being that this photo wasn't taken by the ship the astronauts were on. It was taken by one of the astronauts when he pointed his camera out of the window. This is despite the fact that said astronaut was under specific instructions not to take pictures of that particular area of Earth, and it's not currently known whether or not this event was a mistake made by the astronaut or a conscious decision on his behalf. In any event, the first known picture of the site to eke its way into the public domain was taken in 1968 during a US geological survey. However, as far back as 1955, papers have made passing reference to the facility, referring to it as a super-secret Atomic Energy Commission installation. They obviously sucked at naming things back then. Though the government has always maintained a rather tight-lipped stance on the base, slip-ups have been made in the past. For example, in one-time top-secret Area 51 document, since it's been open to the public, the installation is referred to by that name by then CIA Director Richard Helms in a secret memo discussing air reconnaissance of North Vietnam in 1967. However, for the most part, the government has always either remained coy or simply ignored the site altogether when referring to it in official documentation. As for what it's like to work at Area 51, unlike pop culture would have you believe, the people who worked there aren't forbidden from ever speaking to their family or held in giant underground bunkers a la Independence Day. Just ask James Noyce, who worked in the secret facility for decades, though James has been sworn to secrecy, as is to be expected when you work on highly experimental classified government projects. He's free to talk about his experiences there. For example, James noted that he was always paid in cash, whereas others were paid in checks from companies that they didn't work for. Even more interesting, when a plane from Area 51 crashed once, James was tasked with confiscating the cameras of a nearby family, who were quickly rewarded with a fat stack of cash for their silence. So why do we think aliens are stored there? After all, while the testimonials of people like James and trusted government and military officials with decades of experience do include a number of telling facts about Area 51, he and other people who've spoken out about it have never once alluded to any sort of alien activity ever occurring there. But of course, the government would say that. Governments lie all the time about stuff like this. So what about Roswell? Surely that's when all of the rumors started, right? Well, actually not so much. Though today some conspiracy theorists believe that the craft that crashed at Roswell was of alien origin and that it was or is now being stored in Area 51. When the incident first took place, Area 51 wasn't mentioned in any documentation from that time. Not to mention the fact that the two sites are hundreds of miles apart. If the wreckage was of alien origin and it was moved, it's likely the government would have moved it somewhere closer. Though the Roswell Daily Record from July 6, 1947 did feature the words flying saucer on its front page, secret government facilities, and in particular Area 51, were not mentioned. It turns out it would be another 20 years before Area 51 was even referred to in an official sense. People back then had no idea it even existed, meaning that they'd have been unable to suggest that the wreckage could have been taken there, even if they did believe it was of extraterrestrial origin. In fact, it would appear that the stories about aliens being held in Area 51 are a rather recent invention. You see, it wasn't until 1989 when one Robert Lazar appeared on a Las Vegas TV station under the guise of a government scientist and stated that Area 51 was just full of alien technology that interest in Area 51 and aliens really started to gain momentum. We should mention that almost as soon as Lazar appeared on TV, every single one of his credentials was pulled to pieces. No school he claimed to attend had ever heard of him, and the science behind his so-called theories was soundly debunked. Nevertheless, it caught on from there, and Hollywood picked up on it and spread the idea further, perhaps most famously in the 1996 blockbuster Independence Day. And so, just to sum it all up, Roswell, UFOs, aliens, little green men, and Area 51 were in no way linked as far as popular public opinion was concerned until exactly one man with no credible credentials went on TV and claimed that that was the case. And people have run with it ever since, because that's what people do. It's pretty good news that the lizards are going to take over soon, because we can't be trusted to govern ourselves.
In the immensely popular movie Jurassic Park, there's the famous scene where the giant T-Rex is attacking a Jeep during a thunderstorm. As it attacks, Dr. Alan Grant, a self-respecting paleontologist, yells, "Don't move! He can't see you if you don't move!" Here's the thing. Well, that's wrong. If that comes as a blow, you're definitely not going to want to learn the shocking truth about velociraptors that we're going to be getting to in the bonus fact section. The Tyrannosaurus rex not only could just see fine whether the object was moving or non-moving, which helps one not run into a huge number of things that exist in the world, there's also quite a bit of evidence that the T-Rex's sight was extremely good, very possibly better than modern-day hawks and eagles. This is perhaps unsurprising considering that birds are Cellulosauria theropods, which is the same subgroup that the Tyrannosaurus belongs to. In fact, one of the T-Rex's closest living relatives is actually the chicken. Going back to the film, this non-moving fact from the hit 1993 movie inspired a good deal of research into the subject afterwards. Professor Ken Stevens at the University of Oregon began the project Dynamorph in 1993. His goal was to develop a means to create scientifically useful yet simplified digital models of dinosaur skeletons. Using digital technology, he wanted to recreate tangible visualizations of extinct animals, including the T-Rex. After speaking at a conference in Toronto in June of 1993, the movie was released in the US on June the 11th, 1993. He paid a visit to the Royal Ontario Museum, where he met with North America's leading paleontologist, Garfield Minott. He was working on a life-size reconstruction of a Tyrannosaurus rex that provided Stevens with the lifelike head sculptures of 7 different theropods, bipedal and primarily carnivorous dinosaurs, including a T-Rex and velociraptor. Using these models, a laser pointer, a glass plate, and taxidermic glass eyeballs, Stevens performed experiments to determine the visual field, depth perception, and binocular range, the area that can be viewed at the same time by both eyes of these dinosaurs. He published the results in 2006. Performing a test called inverse perimetry, Stevens evaluated how well a T-Rex would be able to see objects at various elevations and shapes. To quote him, the wider an animal's binocular range is, the better its depth perception and capacity to distinguish objects, even those that are motionless or camouflaged. Stevens determined that a T-Rex's binocular range was 55 degrees, which is wider than even hawks. Stevens continued the research with other theropod dinosaurs and determined that most theropods had binocular ranges at least similar to modern-day raptorial birds, aka birds of prey. Another recent discovery also confirms that vision was an important sense for the T-Rex, as scientists determined that the T-Rex's snout over time gradually grew longer and narrower, cheekbones dipped more inward, and their eyeballs grew bigger. While structurally the T-Rex's head and eyes seemed primed for great vision, the question still remained, well, how good were their eyes really? For that, Stevens took the known optics of distant relatives of the T-Rex, including the eagle, chicken, and crocodile, and plugged them into the larger T-Rex eyeball. He was trying to determine visual acuity, clearness of vision, and greatest distance an object can be seen that still remained distinct. According to his findings, while admitting that these were best-case scenario determinations, the T-Rex may well have had a visual clarity up to 13 times better than a modern human. For reference, an eagle has about 3.6 times the visual clarity of a person. Additionally, it was determined that a T-Rex's vision allowed an object to remain relatively clear up to 6 kilometers away. For humans, it's only about 1.6 kilometers for the same clarity. As Stevens put it, with the size of its eyeballs, the T-Rex couldn't help but have excellent vision. Of course, in the movie, and to a greater and more detailed extent in the book, it is stated that in order to bring these dinosaurs back to life, the scientists needed more DNA to fill the gaps. In the book, they decided to splice dino DNA with bird, lizard, and frog DNA. In the movie, they only use frog DNA to hammer home the plot device that certain species of frogs can change sex when there is significantly less of one sex in the wild. So given this, it may be that dinosaurs in the movie are more frog than actual historic dinosaurs. So if that's the case, while a bit of a stretch, the question that can be asked is, was the statement made by Dr. Grant in the movie actually more about a frog's vision than a T-Rex's? Digging a tad deeper, this quote from the movie by Dr. Grant gives us a clue to what species of frog they may have used. They mutated the dinosaur genetic code and blended it with that of a frog's. Now, some West African frogs have been known to spontaneously change sex from male to female in a single-sex environment. The most common West African frog that has a tendency to change gender is the African reed frog. These frogs see quite on par with other species of frogs with their horizontal pupils, although they cannot see in the red spectrum. Yes, it is documented that frogs have a hard time seeing prey that doesn't move, but not significantly so, such that they'd be blind to the prey. Plus, humans, and really all other prey, do move even when they think they are standing still. Breathing, trembling, involuntary jerks, this is all movement. Additionally, as Kent Stevens said in a response to this moving myth question, if you're sweating in fear 1 inch from the nostrils of the T-Rex, it would figure out you were there anyway. Besides great vision, the T-Rex also had a great sense of smell and had good hearing. In fact, their large olfactory bulbs and nerves relative to their brain size indicates they may have had a sense of smell about equivalent to modern vultures, which are able to smell dead things from as far away as a couple of kilometers. So whether scavenging or hunting, the T-Rex was good at finding things to eat. That said, there is some debate as to just how fast they were, with most scientists today thinking they only had a max speed of about 70 to 25 miles per hour. In the film itself, the character of John Hammond states, "Well, we clocked the T-Rex at 32 mph. Even at that speed, it would have made the Jeep chase scene quite a bit less dramatic than what was depicted. And let's get into that bonus fact. If you thought velociraptors were slightly bigger than a human, reptilian-looking, hunted in packs, were found in what is now the United States, were ridiculously intelligent, and had a thing for Chris Pratt, well, literally none of that is true, except for the last one. I mean, who doesn't love Star-Lord? In truth, velociraptors were actually only about the size of a domesticated turkey, being about 3 feet tall and 6 feet long, with most of the length coming from the tail, and they weighed in at about 20 to 30 pounds fully grown. More than that, they also looked somewhat like a turkey as well, but with a long tail. It turns out that velociraptors were very similar to birds in a lot of ways. They had hollow bones, feathers, they built nests for their eggs, and are thought to have behaved very similarly to birds. As Mark Norrell, curator of fossil reptiles, amphibians, and birds at the American Museum of Natural History, stated, "The more we learn about these animals, the more we find that there is basically no difference between birds and their closely related dinosaur ancestors, like Velociraptor. Both have wishbones, brooded their nests, possess hollow bones, and were covered in feathers. If animals like Velociraptor were alive today, our first impression would be that they were just very unusual-looking birds. More than that, it's generally thought the Velociraptors were solitary creatures rather than hunting in packs, as depicted in the films." Next up, the Velociraptor was not found in the United States as the film suggested, where the paleontologists in the film dug up the Velociraptor skeleton in Montana. In fact, they are typically found in Central Asia around Mongolia. So, were they intelligent? Well, for a dinosaur, it's thought they were somewhat intelligent due to their brain size relative to their body size, but it's not thought they were particularly intelligent overall, and certainly not smarter than dolphins, whales, and some primates, as Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park 3 suggests. So, what were they thinking in Jurassic Park? Well, basically, they modeled what they called the Velociraptor in the movie after Deinonychus. The Deinonychus were also raptors, but were significantly bigger than Velociraptors, coming in at about 12 feet long and about 6 feet tall, and weighing about 150 pounds fully grown. Pretty much picture the Velociraptor in Jurassic Park, and you get a good idea of what these dinosaurs were thought to have looked like, although they also likely had feathers. The Deinonychus also were thought to have occasionally hunted in packs to bring down larger prey, and were thought to have been very fast. Their habitat was also in the forests of North America. Onto the intelligence bit, they were also not thought to be very intelligent compared to dolphins, primates, and the like. However, clearly they were smart enough to work together to bring down larger prey when the need arose. As to why the Velociraptor name was used, even though the creatures were loosely based on Deinonychus, according to Michael Crichton, this was simply because the word Velociraptor was, to quote, more dramatic. Snakes on a Plane was a ridiculous work of fantasy with no basis in reality. But as it turns out, a scenario almost exactly like that once happened over 100 years ago, but on a boat. While some of the details of the event have been lost to history, what we know for sure is that sometime in the closing months of 1889, a ship called the Margaret set sail from the city of Durban in current-day South Africa, helmed by one Captain Sargent. The Margaret was headed for Boston with a rather curious cargo that included at least 100 cockatoos, a dozen or so snakes, 2 crocodiles, an orangutan, a gorilla, and an unconfirmed number of monkeys and parrots. According to a copy of the Sydney Morning Herald from April the 9th, 1890, the animals were destined for a museum, though it doesn't mention which one. Shortly after setting sail, a horde of rats caused chaos by eating through the meager grain stores that had been set aside for the cockatoos and parrots, resulting in the deaths of all but a few of the birds by the end of the journey. The crew's efforts to save the birds were put on hold when a freak gale knocked over some boxes, freeing all of the snakes. At the same time, the crocodiles also managed to escape and entered into a three-way battle royale with the snakes and the rats. Apparently, this made it so that the crew did not have safe access to a large portion of the ships for a reported 5 days. In a bizarre stroke of good fortune, after all of the snakes and rats were dead, the lone surviving crocodile was killed when a second storm hit and knocked over a box of cargo, crushing the crocodile and once again making the hold accessible. But this was not the end of it. You see, all of the monkeys had escaped and had taken refuge on the only place they felt somewhat safe, the ship's rigging. Despite the best efforts of the exhausted crew, they only managed to recapture about 4 of the monkeys before a combination of storms, high winds, and giant waves swept the remainder out to sea, never to be seen again. So at this point you might be thinking, well, this got to be the end of the video, right? Surely it's all over. But oh no, because at the beginning of the video we mentioned something about a gorilla. Yep, along with having a dozen snakes, 2 crocodiles, and a slew of monkeys to deal with on a relatively small ship, the crew also had to figure out how to convince an angry gorilla to climb back into the box that it had forced its way out of. As if that wasn't bad enough, the gorilla also somehow managed to get hold of a sturdy iron bar, which the Wiltshire Gazette reported. With this formidable truncheon, the gorilla threatened to brain every sailor who came within range. The only positive thing going for the crew was that the gorilla was still chained to the floor, though the chain did give it relatively liberal range. It reportedly put up an impressive amount of resistance, injuring almost every member of the crew as they vainly tried to get it back in its container. The worst injury was suffered by the crew's cook, who was apparently partially scalped by a crushing blow to the temple that he failed to duck. The gorilla then grabbed the cook, whose life was only saved by another crew member taking the opportunity of the gorilla being occupied to sneak up behind it and whack it over the head with the blunt end of a hatchet. The stunned gorilla was then forced back into its box. You might be wondering at this point what happened to the orangutan that was stored on board as well. Well, none of the news reports or accounts mentioned that it survived the trip, so presumably it either died the same way the monkeys did, or maybe it was eaten by a crocodile. We just don't know. In January of 1890, the Margaret limped into port in Boston, reportedly a great surprise to the museum staff, who simply assumed that the boat had been destroyed by a storm since it was so late to arrive. In the end, the staff who'd been waiting for their large shipment of animal cargo to arrive found only 4 cockatoos, a few monkeys, and a single gorilla. When the bemused authorities asked Captain Sargent what had happened, he simply responded that between the storms and the animals it was an experience he'd rather not repeat, and he promptly refused to talk about it. Thankfully for those of us who like a bit of odd and obscure history, his crew were significantly less tight-lipped and told the story to anyone who'd listen, leaving us of the 21st century with the humorous 19th century newspaper accounts of the event.
Going to sea as a medieval sailor must have been a terrifying prospect. If by some miracle you weren't shipwrecked by a freak storm or killed by scurvy or some other nasty disease, you risked sailing off the edge of the world into the abyss, or straying into regions unknown filled with horrifying monsters helpfully marked on your map with the ominous warning, "Here be dragons." Or did you? While we like to think of the so-called Dark Ages as a time of profound ignorance and superstition, in reality, medieval people knew far more about the world than we typically give them credit for. But what about the whole "Here be dragons" thing on maps? Well, let's find out all about it as we delve into the weird and wonderful world of medieval cartography. It turns out "Here be dragons," hic sunt draconis in Latin, does appear on a couple historical maps. The first is the Hunt Lennox globe, a 5-inch engraved copper sphere of unknown origin dating to around 1510. Purchased in Paris in 1855 by American architect Richard Morris Hunt and currently owned by the Rare Book Division of the New York Public Library, the Hunt Lennox globe is the 3rd oldest terrestrial globe known to exist, and only the 2nd to depict the then newly discovered continents of North and South America. By contrast, the oldest known globe, the Earth Apple, was completed by German printer George Glockenden in 1492, before Christopher Columbus returned from his first famous jaunt across the Big Blue. Going back to the Hunt Lennox globe, as well as the Americas, the globe also includes a large landmass in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which has been interpreted as evidence that medieval sailors were well aware of the existence, if not the exact position, of Australia. But going back to the whole dragons thing, perhaps the globe's greatest claim to fame is the phrase Hic sunt draconis, which appears engraved along the eastern coast of Asia. The only other appearance of this phrase is on the 1504 ostrich egg globe discovered at the London Map Fair in 2012. As the name implies, this globe was crafted from the lower halves of 2 ostrich eggs joined together. The map engraved on the ostrich egg globe is nearly identical to the Hunt's Lennox, meaning it was likely the prototype for the later globe. So why on earth did the maker of the globe put "Here be dragons" on it? To begin with, some scholars have argued that the phrase "Here be dragons" might actually be a mistranslation. For example, in 1879, American historian Benjamin Franklin da Costa wrote an article on the Hunt Lennox globe for the Magazine of American History, in which he claimed, "In this region near the equatorial line is seen Hic sunt draconis, or here are the Dagroins, described by Marco Polo as living in the kingdom of Dagroin. These people feasted upon the dead and picked their bones." Thus, da Costa is hypothesizing that the phrase refers not to literal dragons or other animals, but rather to a group of people in East Asia. However, French geographer Gabriel Gravert pointed out that Marco Polo's kingdom of Dagorian was likely located on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, far away from the position indicated on the globe. So, perhaps the creator of the ostrich egg and Hunt Lennox maps was referring to dragons after all. On this, noteworthy here, they may have actually been speaking literally and somewhat accurately. You see, it's only been since the 19th century that humans figured out what dinosaur bones were. Before this, these bones, which humans have seemingly been coming across since we've been humaning, seem to have inspired the idea of many legendary creatures, including dragons. For example, the 4th century BC Chinese historian Cheng Qiu reported the discovery of massive dragon bones in the region of Wuchen. At the time, and indeed for many centuries after, including some still today, the Chinese felt that these bones had medicinal properties, resulting in many of them being ground down to be drunk in special elixirs. As for the exact medicinal purposes, in the 2nd century AD Shennong Ban Kangjing, it states, "Dragon bone mainly treats heart and abdominal demonic influx, spiritual miasma, and old ghosts. It also treats cough and counterflow of qi, diarrhea and dysentery with pus and blood, vaginal discharge, hardness and binding in the abdomen, and fright epilepsy in children. Dragon teeth mainly treats epilepsy, madness, manic running about, binding qi below the heart, inability to catch one's breath, and various kinds of spasms. It kills spiritual disruptors. Protracted taking may take the body light, enabling one to communicate with the spirit light, and lengthens one's lifespan." While fossilized bones may not actually make such an effective cure-all, all things considered, the classic depictions of dragons and our modern understanding of what certain dinosaurs look like are actually in the ballpark of accurate. Thus, it's always possible that the "Here be dragons" things may have been referring to such dinosaur remains people had found around the location, and just assume there were probably living dragons still around somewhere given the remains. More on that in a bit. But going back to maps, while the phrase "Here be dragons" appears only twice in such historic maps, a similar phrase, "Hic sunt leones," or "Here be lions," was frequently used on Roman and medieval maps, typically along the southern fringes of the Roman Empire in sub-Saharan Africa. More commonly, however, the phrases "terra periculosa," dangerous land, or "terra incognita," unknown land, were used to denote unexplored areas, the latter originating in Greek polymath Claudius Ptolemy's 150 CE text Geographica. Yet illustrations of dragons, sea monsters, and other mythical beasts did often appear in medieval maps, even if they weren't described in writing. For example, in the Epstorf Mappa Mundi, a map of the world created by German cleric Gervasius of Epstorf around 1232, southern Africa is depicted as being populated by dragons and basilisks, as well as real exotic animals like lions and cheetahs. Similarly, the 1430 Borgia map, currently housed in the Vatican Library, depicts dragon-like creatures in Asia with the caption, "Here there are even men who have large 4-foot horns, and there are even serpents so large that they could eat an ox whole." Moving on from there, a 1450 map by Italian cartographer Frau Moro depicts an imaginary island of dragons in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, while Swedish cartographer Elias Magnus's 1539 Carta Marina shows terrifying creatures like sea serpents, horned whales, and giant lobsters lurking off the coast of Scandinavia. Similar creatures, including the decidedly awesome Ichthyocentaur, part man, part horse, and part fish, also appear in the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the world's first atlas or book of maps, created by Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius in 1570. But while some of these illustrations were simply decorative, indeed many surviving maps of this period were intended not for navigation but for display in the homes of the wealthy, others served a number of practical and symbolic functions. In certain cases, as we hypothesized about the dragon and dinosaur connection, they actually depicted creatures which cartographers believed existed and could potentially be a danger to wayward explorers. It's also important to understand in all of this, medieval Christian doctrine held that nature was eternal and relatively unchanging, and living creatures could not go extinct. Thus, it logically followed that these remains of giant creatures like dinosaurs and various prehistoric sea life must still be alive and well somewhere in the distant, unexplored corners of the globe. Similarly, legends of sea serpents were likely inspired by sailors' sightings of large eels, giant squid, or the like. Furthermore, according to an old theory dating back to the 1st century Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, every animal on land was thought to have an equivalent in the sea. Hence why many of the creatures depicted on medieval maps resembled maritime versions of dogs, lions, pigs, etc. Indeed, this is the origin of the name sea lions for a family of seals and sea cows for manatees and dugongs, the latter of which are thought to be the inspiration for mermaids. In other cases, dragons and other mythical beasts on maps served a more symbolic purpose. For example, an 1855 Japanese map called the Jishin no Ben, which records the damage caused by 2 massive earthquakes in 1854 and 1855, is surrounded by the figure of a dragon eating its own tail, representing the mythological spirit believed to cause earthquakes. Further, in medieval Christian tradition, fire-breathing dragons were often used to represent Satan and the concept of sin. For example, in the Psalter Mappa Mundi, created around 1250, a pair of dragons at the bottom of the map balance out the figures of Jesus and the angels at the top of the map. Indeed, many medieval maps were very different from what we're used to seeing today, being less concerned with geographic accuracy than depicting mankind's spiritual place in the universe. On this note, one of the most common cartographic forms of this period was the TO map, so named because it was drawn on a circle and divided into 3 known continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa by 3 intersecting lines representing the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River, and the Don River. Unlike modern maps, which placed north at the top, TO maps also were oriented with the east at the top, with Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, at the center of the world and, by extension, the universe. While strange to modern eyes, for much of history, such arrangements were commonplace, with the convention of placing north at the top of a map being a relatively recent development. For example, ancient Egyptian maps placed south at the top so that the Nile River flowed downward, while medieval Islamic cartographers followed the same convention in order to place Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, at the top of the map. It was not until the 14th and 15th centuries that northern-oriented maps started becoming standard, the product of European sailors using the North Star Polaris for navigation combined with the introduction of the magnetic compass. And as explorers began venturing even further into the unknown and global transoceanic trade expanded, maps began to evolve from whimsical decorations and depictions of divinely ordered universe into more accurate, practical tools suited for long-range navigation. Among the first such practical maps were the so-called Portolan maps developed in Spain and Italy in the early 14th century. While not always oriented with north at the top, these maps did include a prominent compass rose for orientation, as well as lines of latitude and longitude, wind lines, and other information useful to maritime navigators. And while illustrations of dragons and sea monsters became rarer as time went on, for a time, these figures were used to indicate areas with rich fishing or whaling grounds. For example, German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller's 1516 Carta Marina features the figure of King Manuel of Portugal riding a sea monster off the southern tip of Africa, symbolizing Portugal's dominance over oceanic trade routes. But while the reasons for medieval cartographers including mythical beasts in their work are not always clear, one thing is certain: they did not believe the Earth was flat. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people were well aware that the Earth was a globe, this fact having been common knowledge since antiquity. Indeed, around 240 BC, the Greek polymath Eratosthenes succeeded in measuring the circumference of the Earth with an astonishing degree of accuracy. Eratosthenes' method was based on the observation that every year on the summer solstice at noon, the sun could be seen reflected at the bottom of a water well in Syene, modern-day Aswan in Egypt, Assuming that the rays of the light from the sun were parallel, this meant that the sun was directly above the well, allowing a line to be drawn from the sun to the center of the earth. Next, Eratosthenes planted a stick in the ground in Alexandria, and at noon on the summer solstice measured the shadow it cast, giving him the angle between Alexandria and Syene. He then simply multiplied the distance between Alexandria and Syene, measured as 5,000 stadia, or around 785 kilometers, by 50 to yield a circumference of 250,000 stadia, or 39,250 kilometers, only 2% off from the modern figure. However, over the centuries, the work of Eratosthenes and others was constantly reinterpreted, such that by the 15th century, the commonly accepted circumference of the Earth was 25% smaller than its actual value. It was this error, and not the supposedly heretical belief that the Earth was round, that led Christopher Columbus to launch his 1492 expedition and accidentally bump into the so-called New World. But in the end, while fanciful beasts have long since disappeared from all but the most decorative maps, and the specific phrase, "here be dragons," likewise only existed in a couple historic maps and in modern day board and video games, we should mention it lives on in the field of computer programming, where it is sometimes used to indicate particularly complex or confusing sections of code that just work for relatively unknown reasons, and thus are best left undisturbed.